Donald Trump has delivered what many analysts are calling the most aggressive trade ultimatum in the long and deeply intertwined history between the United States and Canada. This was not a routine tariff dispute. It was not a procedural disagreement buried inside trade committees. It was a direct, public, and unmistakable warning from a sitting American president to one of the country's closest allies: comply fully or prepare for sweeping economic consequences. The significance of that moment cannot be overstated. The United States and Canada share the longest peaceful border in the world. They are NATO allies. Their economies are deeply integrated, from auto manufacturing in Michigan and Ontario to energy pipelines stretching across the plains. For decades, the relationship has been defined by negotiation, compromise, and institutional stability. What unfolded in late February 2026 marked a dramatic break from that tradition. At the center of the confrontation stands Donald Trump and Canada's recently elected Prime Minister, Mark Carney. Carney is not a conventional political figure. Before entering elected office, he led the Bank of Canada and later the Bank of England, guiding major economies through the 2008 global financial crisis and the Brexit shock. He built a reputation for calm crisis management, procedural precision, and institutional loyalty. When Trump issued his ultimatum, Carney did not blink. The sequence of events that followed should concern anyone who values constitutional boundaries, economic predictability, and treaty integrity. Because this dispute goes beyond tariffs, it forces a deeper question. Does the United States honor the agreements it signs? And can a president dismantle, reinterpret, or bypass a trade pact he once celebrated without lasting damage? The roots of the current standoff trace back to December 2025. In a series of public remarks, President Trump revived a provocative idea that Canada might one day join the United States as its 51st state. Canadian officials initially dismissed the comments as rhetorical exaggeration, but behind closed doors, concern began to build. U.S. diplomats reportedly urged Canadian leaders to avoid forceful public rebuttals, a request that only deepened Ottawa's unease. By mid-January, diplomatic communication had cooled noticeably. Then came February 17, 2026. During an off-the-record White House economic briefing, a senior advisor laid out the administration's tariff strategy in unusually blunt terms. Reports from both American and Canadian outlets suggested that the administration framed Canada's refusal to entertain sovereignty-related rhetoric as a political affront requiring economic response. A leaked summary of the briefing reached Canadian parliamentary staff within 48 hours. Insiders described the tone as intentionally provocative, less about correcting trade imbalances and more about enforcing compliance. Carney's team immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. On February 19th, they convened a 6-hour scenario planning session inside the Langevin block in Ottawa, near the House of Commons and the Prime Minister's office. Participants included the finance minister, senior trade lawyers, officials from Global Affairs Canada, the governor of the Bank of Canada, and former IMF veterans who had worked with Carney in London. This was not improvisation. Contingency planning had been underway for weeks. Then, at approximately 6:15 a.m. on February 24th, President Trump posted his formal tariff ultimatum on Truth Social. There was no prior congressional notification, no structured consultation through the U.S. Trade Representative, no joint announcement. It was unilateral and immediate. Within minutes, Carney's chief of staff contacted the Prime Minister. According to government sources, the language of Trump's message aligned almost perfectly with worst-case projections already modeled by Canadian officials. Carney called an emergency cabinet session within the hour. The strategic consensus was clear: respond swiftly, respond legally, and respond in a way that signaled strength not only to Washington, but to global markets. By 7:45 a.m., Reuters reported that Canadian trade lawyers were drafting formal dispute filings under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, better known as United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. By 9 a.m., staff at the Canadian Embassy in Washington had briefed Senate offices from trade-exposed states, including Michigan, Minnesota, Montana, and Ohio, outlining projected economic fallout. Capitol Hill aides later described the briefings as meticulous and persuasive. At 11 a.m. Eastern, Carney stepped before cameras at Rideau Cottage in Ottawa. There were no visible notes, no teleprompter. His tone was steady. "The United States has presented an ultimatum," he began. "Canada does not accept ultimatums. We are a sovereign nation, a founding NATO ally, and a partner in the most significant trading relationship either of our countries possesses." He then announced 3 immediate countermeasures. First, Canada would begin a comprehensive review of export permits for critical minerals, including cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements, essential for U.S. defense and electric vehicle industries. Second, Canada would impose reciprocal 35% tariffs on a targeted list of American consumer goods. Third, Canada would formally invoke Chapter 31 dispute procedures under the USMCA. After a brief pause, Carney added, "Threats against Canada carry consequences." Markets reacted almost instantly. Shares of major American automakers reliant on Canadian components fell sharply in early trading. Energy stocks in the Midwest declined. The S&P 500 dropped nearly 100 points by midday. Investors were not responding to rhetoric. They were reacting to structural risk in North America's integrated supply chains. History offers context. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan imposed tariffs on Japanese semiconductors, triggering retaliation and diplomatic strain before negotiations restored balance. In 2002, George W. Bush introduced steel tariffs to protect domestic jobs. The European Union, Canada, and Japan threatened targeted reprisals. The World Trade Organization ruled against the United States, and the tariffs were lifted within 19 months. The difference now is profound. The current tariffs target a partner within a trade agreement personally negotiated and championed by President Trump during his first term. When he signed the USMCA in January 2020, he called it the greatest trade deal ever made. The agreement established clear mechanisms and limitations regarding tariff changes. Legal scholars argue that invoking emergency tariff authority in this context circumvents agreed procedures. Canada's decision to trigger Chapter 31 shifts the dispute into a binding international arbitration process. These panels operate under defined timelines and cannot be overridden by presidential decree. The White House now faces a strategic dilemma: retreating or negotiating risks, signaling weakness after issuing a public ultimatum. Advancing the full tariff regime invites economic backlash, retaliatory duties, mineral export restrictions, prolonged litigation, and investor anxiety across integrated industries. Defense contractors have taken notice. Canadian cobalt and lithium play critical roles in advanced battery production and military systems. Companies such as Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman rely on stable mineral supply chains. Even the review of export permits introduces uncertainty. Meanwhile, American agriculture is divided. The American Farm Bureau warned of grave risks to grain and livestock exports. Canada is the second largest export market for U.S. agricultural goods. Farmers in politically sensitive states understand that retaliatory tariffs are not abstract policy tools. They hit balance sheets. By mid-afternoon on February 24th, President Trump responded on Truth Social, dismissing Carney's measures as a weak stunt and predicting Canada would soon return to negotiations. But markets continued to fluctuate, and legal procedures moved forward. Beyond economics lies a constitutional question. Congress ratified the USMCA. It carries the force of law. If a president can effectively bypass its dispute and modification frameworks through unilateral action, what does that signal about the durability of American commitments? Inside Washington, unease has grown. Reports indicate bipartisan concern in closed-door Senate Commerce Committee meetings about the legal basis for the tariffs. Trade officials reportedly faced pointed questions. The answers, according to aides, were strained. Internationally, allies are watching closely. The European Union has expressed support for Canada's legal interpretation. Japan and South Korea, each party to significant U.S. trade agreements, are monitoring how this confrontation unfolds. The credibility of American treaty commitments is not an abstract principle. It is a foundation of global economic stability. Yet the deeper significance of this confrontation may not be measured in tariff percentages or daily market swings, but in institutional precedent. Trade agreements like the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement are designed to reduce uncertainty. Businesses invest billions of dollars on the assumption that rules will not abruptly change with a single political statement. Auto plants in Ontario and Michigan, energy grids spanning Alberta and the American Midwest, and integrated agricultural supply chains all function because predictability lowers risk. When predictability erodes, capital hesitates. There is also a strategic dimension. The United States and Canada cooperate not only in trade, but in continental defense through NORAD and NATO. Economic coercion between security partners introduces friction into broader alliances. Adversaries observe these cracks carefully. Stability among allies has long been a pillar of North American strength. Ultimately, this moment forces a reckoning. Is economic power best exercised through dominance or through rules-based leadership? The answer will shape not just US-Canada relations, but how the world interprets American commitments in the decades ahead. Today, the dispute process is underway. Chapter 31 requires consultations within 30 days before formal panel hearings begin. A final ruling may not arrive until late spring. In the meantime, Canada's 35% reciprocal tariffs remain active. Critical mineral permits remain under review. Political pressure builds on both sides of the border. Republican lawmakers from trade-exposed states are quietly exploring options to limit long-term fallout. Democratic lawmakers question executive overreach. Markets remain sensitive to every development. What began as an ultimatum has evolved into something larger, a constitutional stress test, an economic gamble, and a diplomatic rupture. If the tariffs persist and legal challenges proceed unchecked, the consequences may extend far beyond this presidency. North American supply chains could reconfigure. Investors could diversify away from cross-border integration. Future administrations may inherit weakened legal footing within agreements they once considered stable. The next 30 to 60 days will likely determine whether this confrontation stabilizes or reshapes continental trade architecture. But one reality is already clear. This is no routine policy dispute. It is a defining moment for executive authority, treaty fidelity, and the economic bond between two nations that have long defined stability through cooperation rather than coercion. When a president issues an ultimatum to Canada, and Canada responds not with retreat but with legal precision and economic counterweight, the result is not simply tension, it is transformation. And the implications will endure long after headlines fade.